I just wanted to. Are we live already?
Yeah,
Okay, great.
okay. So I'm just going to start with an introduction. So, hi everyone, and welcome whether you're here now or joining a bit later. Welcome to the book discussion of Searches with Vauhini and Radhika Iyengar. Let me start uh, by introducing our speakers and share a little about Champaca. If you have any questions at any point, just drop them in the YouTube chat and we'll get to them at the end. And if you'd like to purchase Searches or any other books by Vauhini or Radhika, there's a link in the description that will take you straight to our website. And I'm Dyuti and I work at Champaca. Champaca is an independent bookstore and children's library in Bangalore. We bring diverse stories and perspectives to readers through our books and events. We have two stores one in Vasanagar and one in Indranagar, and we also ship across the country. And a little about our speakers today. Vauhini Vara is a Canadian and American journalist and author. Her debut novel, The Immortal King Rao, came out in 2022, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. In India, it won the Atta Galatta-Bangalore Literature Festival Book Prize and the Times of India AutHer Award. Radhika Iyengar is an Indian journalist and writer. She won the 2018 Red Ink Award for Human Rights Journalism and Writes on Arts and Culture, Marginalized Communities, History and Gender. In 2023, she published Fire on the Ganges, Life Among the Dead in Benares, which won the Kalinga Literary Award and the Gaurang River Literary Prize for Best Nonfiction. And with that, I'll pass it over to Radhika to get our conversation started.
Thank you so much, Yuti, for that lovely introduction. So happy to have you here, Pawni. I just wanted to tell you that this book of yours has been so insightful, and I really hope everyone who is joining in goes and picks up a copy of this book at their, closest bookstore. Um, I think we should just dive right in. Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I'm quite interested in understanding about your process of writing the book because there is this personal family history that you weave into your book alongside this evolution of technology and the rise of these media giants like Google and Facebook. And it's such a for me it was such an interesting narrative approach, and I was curious what led you to take this ambitious route in terms of.
Yeah. Thanks. And thanks, Radhika, for interviewing me. And by the way, the reason for those who are here, the reason we were late is it was my fault. My camera wasn't working properly. So sorry and thanks for that question. The book had a really roundabout path. I had started writing these sort of experimental things, like these experimental pieces, whose goal was to reveal something about how technology companies exploit us, but also about how we are complicit in that exploitation, right? Like we are partly responsible for our role in that exploitation. Um, so for example, the very first thing I wrote was now actually the title of the book, this essay called Searches, where I wrote this essay, which is now chapter 2 in the book, that was made up entirely of my own Google searches. And the goal there was to show sort of how much self-revelation is possible in our Google search histories. And the way in which like there's something that we find useful about that and even like potentially meaningful about it. And yet, hopefully, one can't read a chapter made up of a bunch of my Google searches over 10 years without also recognizing that the reason that essay exists is that Google, a major company, with a lot of wealth, a lot of power, um, has access, and is the keeper to that archive and is the owner of that archive.
Mm.
So I was writing a series of things like this. I didn't know what they were. I just, my background is as a tech journalist, but I also write creatively. And so it felt like a sort of interesting mode in which to engage with this question. And then I wrote a proposal for the book, which was intended to be just like a book of these sort of experimental things. And so I sold that proposal, which means like I sold as you know, Radhika, it means I sold the book before I'd written the book. And then I put together this book of experimental things and I sent it to my editor. And she said, I think that what you're writing about is this topic of exploitation and complicity, and questions about like whether we as individuals can make our own meaning and derive our own value from our use of these products, or whether our use of these products is always ultimately benefiting the companies behind them more than it's benefiting us.
Mm.
However, I don't know that it's going to be apparent to readers unless you explain that to them. Have you thought about adding an introduction and a conclusion? And I thought about that and realized she was entirely right. And what I decided to do instead of just adding an introduction and conclusion was to sort of add a completely new arc to the book, where each of those experimental chapters now became the even numbered chapters of the book. So, like chapter 2, chapter 4, chapter 6. And then ahead of each of those chapters, I have a more traditional narrative chapter that is intended to use my own experience, but also my journalistic background to explain to readers like what that exploitation looks like, what our complicity looks like, so that then when they enter those more unusual chapters, they have the context to understand like what that chapter is doing there.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating to learn as well, when I was going through your book. And it really is an eye opener. But I also wanted to understand, do you want to actually dive right in and read an excerpt from your book? And then we
Sure.
can probably take a question after that.
Yeah, sure. What should I read, or should I just choose anything?
Do you want to talk about, let's do the conversation you had with your friend Sanam?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay, and I'm realizing my page numbers are probably different from yours.
Mm.
But should I start? Should
I
I
think it's
start?
on page 39 in my book,
Oh
but I
yeah.
don't know.
It doesn't start with one of my closest friends.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, okay. One of my closest friends in Fort Collins, Sanam Imami, is a potter. Sanam is Iranian and was born in Tehran. She first moved to England. She moved first to England during the Iranian Revolution and then to the United States when she was 10. In college in the early 1990s, she studied Middle Eastern women's history. Her mother died when she was 19, and she wanted to better understand her own political and cultural roots. And when she realized she felt a calling as a potter, she became invested in the functional past of ceramics, especially in the Middle East and on the trading routes of the Silk Road. It felt related in a way to her earlier studies and to the nomadic life she had led. Molding clay with her fingers, she sensed a connection with the women from past generations and from all over the world who had done the same, shaping pots and vases and statuettes in the form of their bodies. My son and Sanam's are also close friends, and one afternoon, having taken them to a playground, Sanam and I got into a conversation about Amazon. Sanam refused to use Amazon. I didn't. Her argument for boycotting Amazon was about its rapacious productization and uglification through exploitation of natural resources and labor, of everything real and beautiful in the world. My son and Sanams were climbing trees. They were racing across the grass. They were inventing innovative new uses for playground equipment. I told Sanam that her criticisms of Amazon resonated with me, but that any sustainable solution needed to take place at a governmental level with policies to rein in exploitation. No one could expect their individual boycott to materially affect Amazon's business, which was why I did not boycott Amazon. I could tell as soon as I made this argument that Sunam hated it. She smiled through pursed lips. She was trying, I sensed, not to throttle me. She allowed that I could make the decision that suited me, while she would make the one that suited her. She called to her son, I called to mine. We hugged, still in tension. We left each other. And maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, yeah. I think this conversation between your friend and you reveals many, many things about technology and how um, it's affecting our lives. And then there's, of course, that whole debate about convenience over ethical consumption. I think that's one phrase from your book that I picked on. And do you want to unpack that? How that sort of impacts us in our
Yeah.
daily lives? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the bit that I just read um, reflects, I think, a kind of tension in the conversations we often have about big technology companies, where we tend to say, um, these companies are exploiting us. They're exploiting natural resources, and we really have no choice in the matter. They're so powerful that they have created systems that we feel required to use, and even if we feel ethically compelled not to use these products, it doesn't really matter if any one of us individually stops using them. That was the argument I was making to Sanam, right? And what I didn't read, what comes later in that chapter, is Sunham saying, I know it doesn't make a difference to Amazon's business if I use Amazon or don't use Amazon. For me, that's not the point. For me, the point is living individually according to a set of values that I have. And and for me, that in some ways is like the subject of the book itself, the way in which we hate to sort of see ourselves as villains in any story. But any of us who use these products have to acknowledge that we are playing a role. We are partly responsible for the exploitation of these companies. And and that's what I wanted to write about. Like, I wanted to write about what that complicity looks like, what it feels like. I wanted to write about like the experience of hypocrisy. So after, as you know, after that chapter, there's a chapter made up entirely of my own Amazon reviews of products that I've bought. And over the course of the chapter, like the joke for me of the chapter is I start the chapter with this really high bar. I basically say, inspired by Sunham, I want to try not to use Amazon that much. And then when I do, I'm going to force myself to write a review. My bar starts pretty high. Like, I'm like, well, I did have to use Amazon on this one occasion because my child's teacher had a wish list on Amazon, and that was the only way that you could buy the things she needed for the classroom. By the end of the chapter, I'm saying, I needed to get something mailed to me quickly and I'm in a rush. And so I bought it on Amazon, right? And so the goal for me was to sort of like occupy that position of a villain, of a hypocritical person in that chapter. Um, Not only to sort of tell on myself, but so that others could see themselves reflected in that.
Yeah, I definitely saw myself there.
Yeah.
Sure. What the other thing that I found fascinating when I was going through your book was your use of chat GPT's feedback. Like, there's this whole conversation that you're having with chat GPT where you're giving AI your chapters and asking it for feedback. And I just wanted to know what led you to include the feedback in the book itself.
Yeah.
Um, and then did you feel that somewhere the readers would also then wonder of your role as a writer or a journalist?
Oh, that's interesting. Well,
Yeah.
I do say in the notes in the book that there's nothing in the book itself that actually was written in response to feedback from ChatGPT. So I wrote the book, and
Yeah.
then I kind of enacted this performance with ChatGPT where I like was pretending that I was a writer trying to write a book, right? And but that's a good point, because readers wouldn't get to those notes. I hadn't thought about it this way. Like, readers wouldn't see that note until the end of the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I did want readers to come to the realization. So to set it up, there's like this kind of framing device where you open the book and the first thing you see is me talking to ChatGPT saying, I'm trying to write something. Can you give me feedback? I'm going to give you 2 chapters. And then I give it 2 chapters. And those are the 2 chapters that the reader encounters also. And then you go back into the ChatGPT conversation. So it's true that my goal was for readers to believe at first that, like, to wonder if this writer, the writer of this book, was actually trying to get feedback from ChatGPT that was going to inform the book, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think fairly quickly, hopefully, readers start to see the ways in which ChatGPT is using rhetoric, just like I use rhetoric as a writer, just like readers use rhetoric in their daily lives. ChatGPT is using rhetoric on behalf of OpenAI, the company behind it, um, to influence my book to attempt to influence the direction of the book. So the book is quite critical of the technology industry, for example. And at one point, quite early on, it says, um, one piece of feedback I have for you with this book is to be what's the word? What's the term?
Balance.
Yeah, balanced, to be more balanced. And what it means by that, it explains, is that I should say some more positive things about the tech industry. At one point, it even it even generates for me text about Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT. That just is like this glowing piece of text that makes him sound like the sort of like most visionary and most ethical CEO to have ever lived. And it says, here, maybe you can put something like this in your book. So my goal was to show the way in which, when we use these products, our critical thinking can be dulled, I think, by what seems like sort of like boring or flat rhetoric on the part of ChatGPT, when in fact its rhetoric is very political. It just has the guise, it has like the sort of tone of neutrality. And
Yeah.
so I wanted readers to start to see that. And then eventually in the book, there's a moment where I say explicitly in the conversation with ChatGPT what it's doing. And maybe I can read. Should I read a little bit from that part?
Yeah.
So just to make clear um, what I mean. Okay. Okay. So, oh yeah. So I say, sorry, there's a specific thing I wanted to read.
No worries.
I thought I knew where it was. You know what? Maybe I'll instead read the bit that it suggests that I write about Sam Altman. So, um, so this is where it says to me, like, your portrayal of Sam Altman could be richer. And then without my asking, it says, here's a revised passage of something I'd written about Sam Altman. It says, Sam Altman, the young president of Y Combinator, exemplified the rare combination of visionary and pragmatist. His reputation in Silicon Valley was built on his ability to dream big while keeping his feet firmly on the ground. And it goes on to, at the end of the passage that it suggests that I include, says, in these moments, Sam Altman was more than a CEO. He was a bridge between the worlds of innovation and humanity, striving to ensure that the future he envisioned would be inclusive and fair. So that bears no relation to what I had actually written about Sam Altman. What I had written about Sam Altman um, was in part about the kind of nuanced hypocrisy of his rhetoric. It was not about his being a visionary and a pragmatist and somebody who was going to change the world in positive ways. Um, and so what I'm trying to show here is the way in which like we use these products because we find we benefit, we believe that we benefit somewhat from them. And with these AI products in particular, I think like the contract starts to break down a little. So, you know, with Google, for example, one could argue that at least historically, like Google searching on Google did provide us with information that we found valuable. And in the exchange, Google was able to exploit us. With something like ChatGPT, the argument is that we get some benefit out of using ChatGPT. Um, but I think with products like these, like the actual benefit is there's a question mark around like with the actual benefit too, because I hope it's clear in my dialogue with ChatGPT that there's nothing it offers that's actually valuable to me as a writer. And then there's great harm it's doing in the conversation as well. And I wanted readers to sort of like start to notice that on their own, wonder if the author was aware of that, and then have me say explicitly later in the book the ways in which that's the case.
Yes, but I think so. Let's unpack that because I'm curious because nowadays a lot of writers and journalists are relying on ChatGPT, and so where does that conversation in terms of authorship and ownership of what you write lead to? And by that, what I'm trying to understand is also that sometimes, like for example, your piece Ghosts
Yeah.
was published. It was a collaborative effort with right with
I
AI.
don't think I would use the word collaborative effort because I think collaboration is a term that AI companies love to use to
Yeah,
describe what their products can offer. But there's no way in which a human and a product owned by a big technology company can collaborate. Humans collaborate with other humans, beavers collaborate with other beavers, right? Like it's such a culturally, rhetorically loaded term. That's the only reason I cock my head at the word collaboration.
sure. No, but this in the sense like you have to nowadays a lot of writers are relying on ChatGPT. I mean, it's
Yeah.
quite prevalent,
It,
unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on whose side you're taking. But what are your thoughts on that?
you know, I wonder, it's interesting that you frame it that way because I wonder if there are differences globally in this because from what I see in the US, like writers are not and journalists are not using ChatGPT. People who would like to produce writing but aren't employed as writers or journalists seem to be turning to ChatGPT because they feel that there's like something they want to express. They could use some help expressing that and they feel that ChatGPT can provide that. But I actually, in my world here in the US, like it's not common for writers and journalists to employ ChatGPT in their work. Is it different in the Indian context?
Not really, but there are a lot of people who, in terms of just like modes of communication, even writing an email,
Oh,
people,
yes. Yeah.
they would just, and I'm not talking about writers in general. I'm sorry if I mentioned that, but like
Yeah.
people, everyone is now sort of relying. And then I also
Yes.
feel like we're somewhere relinquishing our control over our own thought processes.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
We're allowing Chat GPT to do most of the brain work.
That's
Uh,
exactly right. Yeah.
so that was something that was worrying me a lot, and I wanted to know your thoughts on that.
No, I fully agree. I mean, and that's the point of the chat GPT exercise in the book, right? Because you hopefully can't come away with it thinking, oh, it seems that chat GPT is providing useful feedback for this writer. It's so clear the ways in which it's corrupting, attempting to corrupt the work itself. And so as a thought exercise, hopefully a reader can think, well, what if like a writer actually were to use advice like this, that would have totally like that would have left me with a totally different book, a book that is like a pro big technology industry book that's saying that Sam Altman is a visionary, right? So that's the message. That's the intended message of this. I also write in the book about the ways in which I think like these products rhetorical influence can be really insidious. So as you know, I write in the book about my dad's reliance on ChatGPT to edit his emails. And one example that I give in the book is the way in which he had written me an email about my book, actually. So I'd sent him passages from my book that involved him. And he wrote me an email and he sent me the ChatGPT edited version where it said, um, if you really want to understand what somebody is experiencing, you have to sit down and talk with them. Only then can you really understand what they're going through. And then he also sent me his original version, and the sentence was exactly the same, but instead of saying only then, he said then only, which, in Indian English is a totally natural and common way to express oneself, to say, if you want to understand someone's experience, you have to sit down and talk to them. Then only can you understand what they went to, what they have gone through. So what was happening in his asking ChatGPT to correct his English, what ChatGPT was actually doing was taking his perfectly legitimate and correct English and turning it into American English, which is not a better English, and in fact is an English spoken by far fewer people, I would guess, than the English spoken than Indian English, in which that then only construction is more common. And so, there are all kinds of insidious ways in which when people use ChatGPT to do things like correct their emails, um, chat, that rhetorical influence of ChatGPT is very present. Another example that's not in the book actually is that I did a radio interview here in the US that was entirely about this subject. It was about my book, and we talked about sort of like the messages in my book about the insidiousness of big technology companies' rhetoric, including through their products like ChatGPT. And my dad asked a young cousin of mine, I guess niece of mine, to listen to the interview and send me an email about her thoughts. And she sent me this email, and it said, hello, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed your interview about the ways in which AI can benefit us and enrich our lives. And I wrote back to her and I said, "You wrote this with ChatGPT, didn't you?" And she said, "Yes, I did." um, and there were two reasons that I could tell she had written it with ChatGPT. One is that the tone just didn't sound like her, and it wasn't the tone anybody would use to speak to their cousin who they know pretty well, and but the second was that the way that email was describing the interview described something that was the opposite of what the interview was. Like the interview had been quite critical, but her email had described an interview that was very positive. And that was the second clue for me, because it was doing the exact same thing that it did in my book.
That's quite interesting. That's an interesting anecdote. Great. Would you like to read another passage, maybe?
Yeah,
Uh,
sure.
Before we open the floor to the audience, and if they have any questions, yeah.
Yeah. What should I read?
Do you want to read about where Sam Altman compares humans to horses?
Oh,
I
sure.
think it's
Yeah.
a very telling passage.
Yes. Okay. So in 2017, I wrote a magazine profile of Sam Altman, and in particular, it focused on Sam Altman's political involvement at that time. So I'll just read like a little paragraph from that. One day, as I sat in on a meeting between him and a couple of entrepreneurs he'd invested in, he pulled out his phone and asked them, "Want to see something cool?" The entrepreneurs leaned in, curious, as he played a video. "That's a robot doing a one-handed Rubik's Cube solve," he explained. "A breakthrough from OpenAI." When one of the entrepreneurs asked him when AI would start replacing lots of human workers, Altman brought up what happened to horses when cars were invented. For a while, he said, horses found slightly different jobs, and today, there are no more jobs for horses. I realized with some alarm that Altman seemed to be comparing humans to horses. The difference between humans and horses, of course, is that humans are human. That is, we have a vested interest in the employment status of this particular species.
Wow. Yeah. I think that left me. I mean, I was honestly very stunned that he said something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the book is full of such interesting nuggets and information. So thank you so much for writing it. And I think now we have time for audience questions, if there are any. I'm just gonna see. Jyoti?
Hi. Yeah.
Hi.
There is one question. What was the most fun part of the book to write?
Ooh, the most fun part of the book. There's a chapter in the book that we haven't talked about, where it was a really fun book to write. There's so many things I could talk about. But one chapter is intended to show how the biases and assumptions built into AI products influence their output. And so in one chapter, I'm using like AI image generation products to show that. And so I'm telling the story about my family background, especially on my mom's side. My mom grew up in a small village in Andhra Pradesh, and medium-sized village town in Andhra Pradesh. And she would always, when I was growing up, she would always tell me stories about her childhood and her family. And so as an exercise, I asked various AI image generation products to create images to go along with sort of written stories that my mom had shared with me that I was putting in the book. And because these products tend to be disproportionately trained on images from the United States, and then secondarily images from Europe, um, they they very much reflect a kind of American and European worldview. So, for example, research shows that from a couple of years ago showed that if you ask these image generation products for a picture of a house, what they'll come up with is a picture of a traditionally American looking house. And the same is true of all kinds of other things. If you ask for a bedroom, it'll be a traditionally American looking bedroom. Um, and so I wondered what would happen if I tried to ask these products to generate images reflecting a world that wasn't part of that wasn't captured well in the material used to train these models. And what ended up happening is that the images that it produced just were sort of like laughably, ridiculously not representative of the experiences I was writing about. So the reason that comes to mind when I talk about like when I'm asked about what was most fun is that like it made me laugh a lot, that chapter, because I was writing about some really difficult, dark experiences in part. And then it would just generate these ridiculous images that had nothing to do with those actual experiences. And it was funny. It was darkly funny.
Great. Amazing. Any other questions, Jyoti?
No, that's all. That question was by Radhika.
Okay. Um,
Okay. So since there are no more questions, we'll wrap up the discussion.
would you like to talk about the cover of the book? Because I found that quite intriguing and
Yeah.
unconventional. So, would you like to briefly talk about that?
Yeah. Of course. Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of back and forth on the cover. Uh, at first, the cover changed a lot over time. There were various versions of the cover that didn't feel right to me because they felt like I felt like the book needed a cover that sort of like contained the same kind of like joke that the book contains about like what these technology companies promise us and where they fall short. And we couldn't figure out to do how to do that. And finally, actually, the art director at my publisher, Pantheon, and her husband, who's also a designer, were apparently just like talking about the book at home in the evening, and they realized that they had thought of a way in which like the cover could show the joke itself. And so the joke of the cover is that it has all this text on it, like so there's a image. That image is actually in the book itself. It's a 17th century painting, 17th century painting by a Flemish artist named Clara Peters that I love, and that hangs in the Prado, and I write about it in the book. Um, but so what they did was they took the title of the book and they fed it to ChatGPT and said, "What do you think this book is about?" And then they fed it the image and they said, why does it make sense for this image to be on the cover of the book or something like that? And they took ChatGPT's answers, which are not really relevant to the book. And they put that on the cover. And so what you see here is like a description of the book and why this image is used to illustrate the book. That's totally false. And it's false because it was generated by AI. And so the goal is for that to be like a kind of provocation because you expect text on a book to be telling the truth. You expect a book to contain only authorship by the writer. And because the book itself includes text generated by AI, not because that text is like any good, but actually because that text is insidious and harmful, we wanted to figure out how to like put that on the cover as well. So here you have a book whose cover is actually fake news because it's generated by AI.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Mm,
But thank you so much, Vauhini, for explaining that. And
yeah.
it's been amazing. It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time and, you know,
Th-
speaking to me.
Thank you. It was really nice talking to you, Radhika.
Likewise.
And thanks, Diti, for setting everything
Yes,
up.
Jyoti, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for such an insightful conversation. Uh, we really hope to see you at Champaca soon. And if anybody wants to buy the book, the link is in our description. Um, yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
See you. Good luck. See you soon.